Chapter 13. At some point during the night, the storm had passed, and the Naoma Louise had set sail. The night had been restless for Camille. What possessed her to think she could pretend to be married to a guy like Julien de Laurent for 6 months and not develop a consuming desire to have sex with the man? All night long he'd invaded her thoughts, her dreams, her heart. The only place he hadn't invaded was her bed, and that was the one place she wouldn't have turned him away, even though it was the smart thing to do. But he had slept on the sofa in their bedchamber. She'd thought it looked uncomfortable, but he'd fallen asleep almost instantly and hadn't awakened, even after she had started moving around in the bathroom that morning. Sunshine and blue skies peeked in through the window. She slipped into a black bikini that fit like it had been made specifically for her body. Camille studied herself in the mirror, surprised at how good she looked. She grabbed a towel and her sunglasses and ventured outside. Finding a swimming pool on the upper deck surprised and pleased Camille. She grabbed a lounge chair and made herself at home. For a while she drank in the sight of the open sea, observing nothing but water and small dots of land off in the distance. Soon drowsiness accompanied her into a nap. She couldn't be certain how much time had passed since she'd fallen asleep, but footsteps fell over the deck, and Camille opened her eyes behind her sunglasses. Julien, in a pair of deep green boxer shorts, jolted her heart. She swallowed hard. Acting on such an attraction, no matter how much she wanted to, would be perilous, because in 6 months he'd send her packing. His eyes raked daringly over her, and his mouth softened. "Good morning, Cherie." He straddled the chair beside her. "I trust you slept well last night?" Hell no. She'd had the worst night ever. And how dare he tease her like that? "Fine, thanks." Fortunately, she had the shades to cover her eyes, which probably contradicted her lie. "How about lunch? Are you hungry?" He extended his hand, his knuckles skimming against her bare thigh. She inched her leg away and tipped her sunglasses, peering at him with one eye closed. "What's on the menu?" "Whatever you want." "Whatever I want." A slight moan trickled up her throat. To stop it from blasting out in a full-blown expression, she lunged forward and threw her legs over the edge of the chair. "Lunch, that sounds like a plan." Julien chuckled and stood, reaching for her hand. She draped her fingers over his, igniting a quick shiver that rolled through her. On the far side of the boat, a fully furnished table under an umbrella commandeered her attention. He let go of her hand and seated her with her back to the sun. She worried about him as he moved to the other side, hoping the umbrella would provide him with shade. The attendant, Jonathan, appeared with 2 lobster tails, fresh fruits, and various green and pasta salads. Lobster tails? For lunch? "Oh, no," she said, thinking about the fat and calories that came as a packaged deal with all this rich food. "What?" Julien asked, as if his feelings had been hurt. "You don't like lobster?" "Oh, no, I like lobster just fine." She didn't want to sound ungrateful. "In fact, I love lobster." She paused, and while she didn't want to hurt his feelings, there were consequences for eating so recklessly. "But if I keep eating like this, in 6 months I'll be as big as a house." A flash of humor curled on Julien's lips. He grabbed his champagne glass. "Make a list of the foods you'd prefer to eat and give it to Soren when we return home. He'll relay your instructions to the kitchen." "Man, you sure are accommodating." Camille dipped a piece of lobster in fresh butter. She popped it into her mouth, and the flavors, sweet and rich, engaged her taste buds and filled them with immense pleasure. "Well, I aim to please," Julian said. They focused on their meal with bits and pieces of small talk about the weather, the Naoma Louise, and the Mediterranean around them. Afterward, Julian suggested they have dessert indoors, and they moved inside to an informal dining area. She followed his lead and slipped into a chair at one corner of a very large table. Jonathan brought them each a covered tray. The dish was cold, very cold. "What is this?" she asked, pointing to the silver lid. Julian looked at her with amplified innocence. "Is it ice cream?" A sense of defeat swept over her. "Please don't say yes." He smiled. Damn. She was doomed. "You know, you've really got to start paying attention." She paused, trying to gulp down the lump swelling in her throat. "Because a house, remember that." The smile spreading across his face was as intimate as a kiss. He lifted the cover, revealing an ice cream sundae. A diamond-studded heart pendant on a gold chain was draped around the crystal bowl's stem. "That's beautiful." Camille sucked in a breath filled with joy and then sorrow and disappointment. Disappointment that she hadn't been able to find a man such as Julian for real. Her very own Prince Charming. She sighed. But why? She summoned the courage to look at him. Their marriage wasn't real. Why was he baiting her with the actions of a real husband? "After all you put up with yesterday," he said, "it's the least I could do." The look on his face, genuine regret, softened her concern and eased her doubt. She wanted to hug him, kiss him, tell him she was his for the taking. But that wasn't wise. The only thing it would get her was some serious heartbreak time. "You're very kind," she said, and dropped it at that. Filling with reluctance, she unwrapped the necklace from the dish. Her heart pounded as Julian rose and moved around behind her. He slipped the trinket from her hand in a slow, seductive movement. Gentle strokes pulled her hair out of the way, and he looped the bauble around her neck. No matter how hard she fought it, her desire for him intensified. Julian's hands skimmed down her bare arms, patted them twice, and then he returned to his seat. Of course he'd touch her like that, seductively, and then walk away. She studied him with a calculated gaze. There was no way in hell she'd survive being teased by him for the next 6 months. No way. She pulled her attention away from him and let it roam around the deck. Nothing, not a thing to use as a viable distraction, except the inner cabin. She pushed herself up from the table and sauntered toward the double doors. She hurried inside, met by a blast of cool air. A wall on the far side displayed a group of family photographs. Maybe there'd be one from his childhood that she could poke fun at. That would lighten the mood. She perched her hands on her hips and scanned the images. A picture of 2 boys sitting in a woman's lap caught her eye. The children were nothing more than toddlers, and Camille assumed they were Julian and Andre. The woman in the picture, presumably their mother, had a wonderful smile and laughing eyes that reminded her of Julian when he got really excited. Pointing to the picture, she glanced over her shoulder. "Is this your mother?" He nodded, a pleased look crossing his face. In an instant, Julian was at Camille's side and removing the photograph from its place on the wall. Stilling, he studied the picture, drawing a heavy breath. Finally, when he did move, He took the photograph and went to the couch on the other side of the room. Camille followed.
This was taken just weeks before she...
His words faded, and he looked at Camille. The memory had stolen the laughter that usually resided in his eyes.
Well, it's nice of Claudette not to complain about your mother's pictures being displayed here.
While Claudette has been a wonderful mother figure,
he almost laughed.
This is not the family's boat. It's mine.
He glanced around.
Much of what you see here, the decor, the photographs, it all belonged to my mother. These were her personal items.
Wow.
A frenzy of sudden, spinning sorrow toppled her poise. The tribute to his mother said something about what Julian valued in life.
This is a great way to honor your mother and keep her memory alive.
Papa thinks I'm spending too much effort on the past,
he said trivially, setting the framed picture on the coffee table. Julian shrugged and leaned back on the couch, spreading his arms along the back. Camille relaxed, crossed her legs, and folded her arms over her chest.
I wouldn't say that.
Phantom tears stained her heart.
It shows a devotion to your mother's memory, and that's a very appealing quality.
A lonesome sort of smile gave way to lips skewing into a tight pucker on his face. Clearly, the hurt over losing his mother was getting to Julian. Physical need and a longing drove Camille toward him. A knot rose in her throat. She felt like a breathless teenager. The notion that this might be a bad idea slipped into her mind, but she cast it aside in favor of an inherent craving to comfort him, something she thought no one had ever attempted. Camille snuggled up to Julian and trailed her soft, silk-like fingertips over his face. Her touch was affectionate and soothing, and on the verge of becoming too powerful to resist. Julian closed his eyes and skimmed his hand up her arm. She dropped her forehead on his chest and let out a pleasurable sigh. His hands trailed over her shoulder as if they had a mind of their own and explored the hollow of her back.
If you're going to stop me,
he whispered into her hair,
please have mercy and do it soon.
She lifted her head slowly and implored him with her eyes before leaning in and kissing him with a hunger that contradicted her outward composure.
I'm not going to stop you.
Her lips brushed against his as she talked. Julian caressed her untamed hair out of her face.
Cherie.
He traced his fingers along her cheek.
If you become uncomfortable at any time, just tell me and I'll stop.
I want to be with you. That's all I know,
she said, wrapping her arms around his neck.
I've never wanted anything so badly in my whole life.
Julian let her down onto the couch and trailed soft, sensuous kisses across her face and down the length of her neck. His hand brushed against the patch of fabric covering her breast. She sighed. He grazed his pelvis against her thigh and felt himself growing hard. She turned herself toward him as if she wanted the contact. Julian watched his own actions intently, pushing the triangles of fabric away from her breasts, first one and then the other, exposing her nakedness. He swallowed hard. He'd been wanting to do this from the first moment he'd laid eyes on her. Cupping her breast in his hand, he leaned down and teased her playfully, running his tongue over her nipple. She moaned and arched her back, trying to find him. "Patience, chérie." He gave her a smile born from affection, wanting to taste her lips now. He seized her mouth, kissing her hard and long. Watermelon. She tasted like watermelon. Breathlessly, she locked her arms around his neck and pressed her naked breasts against his chest. Her nipples brushed firmly against his own bare skin. Urgent desire swept through him, catching him off guard. He drew a deep breath, the sweet scent of her perfume, the Dior he'd bought her, invaded his senses. Julian grazed his fingertips over her stomach and down between her legs. Camille let out a delightful gasp, and a slight moan escaped her lips as his fingers touched her. She arched her hips, encouraging him to explore further. He danced playfully, and she moved quickly, trying to match his pace. Encouraged by her, Julian's own desire throbbed inside his briefs, desperate to be let loose. As if instantly aware of the bulge pulsating against her thigh, she reached out and touched him, running her hand along the outside of his boxers. She quickened her pace under his touch. She was too close to the edge. He stopped abruptly, pulling away. He stood and removed his briefs. Her eyes sprang open, and her surprise got tangled in her throat, escaping in a gritty groan. Julian climbed back on top of her and paused, gazing down upon her angelic face. She flushed crimson. Their eyes locked, and their breathing merged in unison. "Do you want me to go on?" He gave her one last opportunity to back out, to be sure this was what she really wanted. She smiled, pulling him closer. "Don't you dare leave me hanging now," she whispered, opening her legs. Clearly an open invitation, Julian ripped the bikini bottoms away from her body and pushed his way inside her. She wrapped her legs around him, and he began gliding in and out, slowly at first, until his desires took over and he pumped faster. Wave after wave of her delight burst rhythmically around him. "Chérie," Julian muttered the endearment as he filled her instantly with his own satisfaction. Feeling as though she had claimed every ounce of energy that he had to give, he relaxed lifelessly on top of Camille. "Wow," she said softly, breathlessly. "I didn't hurt you, did I?" He genuinely hoped he hadn't. "No," she giggled slightly. "You didn't hurt me." "That's good," he said with a bit of aloofness. He knew he should get up, but she felt so good, so right. His manhood pulsed and slipped out of her as if it knew retreating was the best course of action. She moaned as if disappointed. "I'm sorry, chérie." He paused for a moment, drinking in the striking afterglow shining on her face. "I shouldn't have let it go that far." He pushed himself off the couch, torn between culpability and contentment. "You've been more than vocal that this wasn't to be part of the bargain." He scooped his shorts off the floor and slid into them, positioning them comfortably around his waist. "Just say the word and it won't happen again."
"Look, I know this is not real. It's a business deal," she acknowledged. "But there's no reason why it can't be a business deal with benefits."
That wasn't exactly what he wanted to hear, and once he realized it, he found it disturbing. Not to worry, though. In 6 months, he would have had his fill of her and be happy to see her go. Julian had breakfast brought into their stateroom the following morning. He'd anticipated and was pretty sure Camille was in complete agreement that they'd spend much of this day in bed. Not having to venture far for food was advantageous. She had been eyeing the plain black box, larger than the average jewelry case, with its gold ribbon tied around it in a neat little bow. It had come in with the breakfast cart.
Come here.
He scooted his chair back and motioned her over with a lazy wave. She sauntered around the small table and straddled his lap, awakening his loins. He slid the box toward them and presented it to Camille.
This is for you.
She took it, giving him a narrowed glance, and eased it open. Finding a wallet-sized leather-bound checkbook and a credit card, both stamped with the name Camille de Laurent, she shot him a twisted smile. She opened it and fanned the checks before stopping to look at the check register. Camille's mouth dropped open and she stared wordlessly. He'd guess she'd seen the amount on the liberal credit line. She looked at him, her face etched with shock and surprise. "What is this?"
"You're going to need some cash at your disposal."
"A credit card isn't cash."
"It's pretty close."
"Why do I need this much cash available to me?"
She paused, her look of surprise giving way to suspicion.
"This has nothing to do with last night, does it?"
"No."
He adjusted her in his lap, running his hands beneath her satin robe. She was naked underneath it. He enjoyed the feel of nothing but his silk boxers between them.
"It has nothing to do with last night, this morning, or tomorrow."
"Good,"
she panted, her chest heaving.
"Because I don't want to start feeling like a kept woman."
"Kept women aren't, by definition, wives,"
he said, exploring further beneath the soft, silky robe.
"What am I supposed to do with the checkbook and credit card?"
Her arms enfolded him.
"Whatever you want. It's your money to spend."
He pressed her against him.
"I'm sure Claudette and Lacy will insist that you accompany them on regular shopping sprees. Buy whatever you want."
It's what was expected of his wife. And above all else, Julian couldn't forget the marriage needed to look authentic. That's all it was. It just needed to look that way. And the sex, well, like she'd said, it was a business transaction with benefits. Yes, that's all it was. Chapter 14. Camille was saddened when their honeymoon cruise ended. She had to keep reminding herself that it wasn't real, even if they had spent the last 10 days having some incredible sex. And returning to Pacifique de Lumière under the cover of night felt like they were sneaking back in. But she refused to buy into those insecurities and fears. Instead, she let her mind wander to a place filled with possibilities as she followed Julian upstairs to their new suite just a few doors down from Tasha's room. Next morning, she realized she had taken too much for granted when Soren gave her the news. Camille charged into Tasha's room. Raw nerves bore down heavy in her gut at the sight of her only friend packing.
"You're leaving?"
Camille's voice cracked.
"Why are you leaving so soon? Did somebody do or say something to upset you?"
Her fear of being abandoned gave way to suspicion. She wouldn't be surprised to find that Maurice or Madeleine, or both, were responsible for Tasha's decision to leave. "When have you ever known me to shy away from a challenge?" Tasha said, as if that notion was the most ridiculous thing in the world. "It's just time for me to go home." Camille didn't say anything. lost in a moment of deep pessimism. Somewhere deep in her psyche, she wondered if she could will Tasha into staying. "This is your world now, but it's not mine." Her words cut through Camille like a sharp dagger. "Guess not." "Mine's in L.A., where I need to find work soon or I'm screwed." She laughed, as if it wasn't that big a deal, but Camille saw the worry in her vivid green eyes. Julian had given her a spending account with a generous endowment. If she was going to use it, why not splurge on something worthwhile? She grabbed Tasha's hand and pulled her out the hallway and into her suite of rooms. Tasha waited in the doorway as if entering would have some ill-affected consequences. Camille grabbed her leather-bound checkbook from a desk drawer and used a nearby table to issue her first check. It ripped from the book with relative ease, and she waved it in the air at her friend. "What's this?" Tasha's eyes danced anxiously. "Just in case L.A.'s on a mean streak when you get back." Tasha slipped the check between her fingers and glanced at it, her eyes widening. "Wow! 10 grand!" She struggled with the silence for a moment and finally said, "I can't take this." "Sure you can." "I doubt I'd ever be able to pay it back." She shook her head. "I can't take it. It's not a loan. It's a gift from one friend to another." Tasha shook her head again, her mouth tightening. She closed her eyes. "No, I don't want to get you into trouble with Julian." She paused and slowly raised her gaze to meet Camille's. "What'll he say when he finds out you're giving away money?" "Julian gave me the money to do with as I please." Camille shrugged. "I choose to give it to you." Tasha moaned and tapped her foot. "You let me know if he makes a fuss, and I'll send it right back," she said with a bit of reluctance. "Whatever I've spent, I'll find a way to pay you back. Don't worry about it," Camille said, taking her arm and leading her to the door. "He said I could spend it any way I wanted. I'm so afraid I'm never going to see you again." Tasha's words were drenched in angst. "Oh, you'll see me again," Camille blurted out without thinking. "I'll make sure of it," she added, trying to cover her blunder with a well-meant declaration. "Well, I guess so," she said, almost bitterly, following Camille into the hallway. "Your husband does have a fleet of private jets, and he can take you anywhere you want to go." Immediately, regret cast a shadow over Tasha's face. But Camille knew Tasha was feeling abandoned. She was losing her best friend to a husband half a world away. And Camille knew a thing or two about abandonment. There was no way to spin it to make the one left behind feel better. "You know," Camille said as they descended the stairs, "you can always act in France." She put it out there to see if Tasha would bite. She didn't. "Are you kidding?" she shrieked. "Like they want to see some American on their TV screen?" "Jerry Lewis." "Huh?" "Jerry Lewis," Camille repeated. "He's an American, and the French love him. Everybody loves Jerry Lewis," Tasha snorted, and then her face sobered. "I'm no Jerry Lewis." She had a point. They stopped at the entryway, and Julian came in through a door on the far side. His first move was to kiss Camille's cheek.
"Good morning, darling."
"Ooh, darling."
Tasha's voice bordered on dreamy. "The honeymoon must have gone really well." Camille smacked her. Andre entered from a different doorway. Looking at Tasha with suitcases by her side, his smile faded.
"Cherie, are you going somewhere?"
She sighed and got this poignant look on her face.
"Andre, you have been a dear, really, but it's time for me to go home."
"Cherie!"
Andre slammed his hand against his chest.
"You break my heart."
Julian took one look at Andre and another at Tasha. When his attention landed back on Andre, Julian's face turned into a scowl.
Soren!
Julian bellowed his valet's name. Soren appeared from out of nowhere.
Yes, sir. You will accompany Miss Gordon back to Los Angeles. Me, sir?
Soren failed to hide the shock.
I'll accompany her,
Andre said.
No.
Julian stared at his brother.
You have other business that needs your attention.
If looks could kill, Julian's came with a loaded 9mm. Andre paused, slipped Tasha's hand in his, and brushed his lips against it.
Sherry, I await your next visit.
He bowed.
Do not make me wait long.
He gave her one of those looks that moved even Camille. It reminded her of Julian. 2 heartthrobs in one family. The girls in France weren't safe. Neither was Camille. Tasha was the fortunate one. She was leaving. Julian leaned in and kissed Tasha's cheek, then moved immediately back to Camille's side.
Tasha, your visit was a pleasure.
He smiled and rested his hand on the small of Camille's back.
I do hope you'll come back soon. Any time you'd like to get away, just let Camille know, and we'll send a plane for you directly.
He turned to Camille, wanting very much to run back upstairs with her. But Papa had said it was important, and it probably was, according to Papa. He could wait. At least a couple of minutes. Julian grabbed Andre by the arm and dragged him into the west hallway. He closed the door and leaned against it, arm outstretched.
Are you insane?
Andre remained silent. He slipped his hands inside his trousers pockets and waited. Julian hated it when he did that, but it wouldn't stop him from admonishing his little brother.
Didn't I tell you specifically, do not sleep with Camille's friend?
In all fairness, I did not sleep with her.
Andre defended his case.
I'm in no mood for your play on words.
Julian paused, drawing his hands into fists at his sides.
If you leave that girl broken-hearted, then my wife will become upset. If she's upset,
Andre laughed.
I know, you don't.
Andre's words trailed off, as if recalling the last time he'd said something rude and risque about Camille.
Check yourself, baby brother,
Julian warned.
You've got it all wrong,
Andre said, almost sulking.
How's that? I asked her not to leave.
What? Rippling waves of shock slapped at Julian. He didn't know which was worse, Andre being a cad or Andre falling for Tasha. That's the worst thing that could happen. How could Julian walk away guilt-free at the end of 6 months if Camille's friend became his sister-in-law?
I want you to stay away from that girl.
Julian's finger popped up in Andre's face, accompanying his order.
Do you understand?
Andre walked to the door and paused, looking over his shoulder.
Why do you get to have all the fun? Apparently, I'm not the only one.
Julian's thoughts lingered on Andre until he disappeared around a corner. There was no putting it off any longer. Papa was waiting. Julian headed in the direction of his father's study. He whistled a jovial tune as he trekked through the halls and stopped at Papa's door. Summoning his courage, he knocked.
Come!
Papa's voice traveled through the walls. Julian opened the door. Papa's bottle was already out of the drawer. An audacious move that desiccated Julian's confidence. If he was bold enough to flaunt the liquor in the off-chance Claudette walked in, whatever had Papa so troubled, it must be bad.
Papa?
Julian took to his pockets to keep from openly fiddling with his hands. His knees weakened as he progressed across the room, which seemed much too small today. Papa gestured toward the empty chairs in front of the desk. Julian hesitated and sank into one.
How was the cruise?
Papa's tone was much too gentle and accommodating. What's this? A trap? Julian hesitated. In the whole of Julian's life, Papa had never made small talk with anyone, not that he'd ever heard. His attempt reminded Julian of a spider stalking a fly that was on the verge of landing in his web. That was a snare Julian wasn't about to fall into.
Fine.
Papa filled a shot glass and pushed it gently across the desk. Julian reached for it, feeling like a fly that was coming dangerously close to the spider's web. He pulled the drink toward him and left it sitting on the edge of the desk. Take that. Two could play this game. Julian had, after all, learned from the best. Papa saluted and drained his glass. Julian didn't have the guts to say, "Should you be drinking that, and so early in the day?" But it was on his mind. His father's health worried him daily. Papa opened the center drawer, pulled out a manila envelope, and tossed it across the desk.
"What's that?"
Julian asked, avoiding it. He wasn't playing.
"It's a dossier on your wife."
Julian tried to keep a stoic face.
"Why?"
His discomfort snuck out as awkward fidgeting. Maurice's right jaw twitched.
"See for yourself,"
he said, waving his hand over his desk.
"Why don't you just save me the trouble and tell me what you think you've uncovered?"
Surely there couldn't be this much commotion over finding out Camille had acting aspirations. Papa studied him for a moment with that cold, calculating glare of his and pulled a box of cigars out of his desk. Not the cigars. He brought out his trademark technique of smoke screening a weak accusation. On the surface, that looked like a good thing, but Papa could be brutal when he didn't get his way, and Julian wasn't about to let that happen. The sweet scent of cognac followed the smoke as it floated about the room. Julian loved that smell. It reminded him of his childhood. But Papa rarely smoked the aromatic cigars anymore, not because he couldn't afford them, but because Claudette's nose was stronger than a bloodhound's. She must be in town, or perhaps Paris. Nothing else ever induced Papa to act so carelessly. He puffed on his cigar a couple of times.
"You've brought a wolf into the lion's den."
What? That made no sense. Julian searched his brain, coming up with nothing. Papa was losing his mind.
"Perhaps you'd better spell it out for me."
Julian met Papa's accusing eye without flinching.
"I have no idea what wolf I've let into what lion's den."
Did this have something to do with a business deal? He'd wrapped up the merger, a la takeover, of Dine Shipping nearly a month ago, which is why he had felt comfortable going to America to find Camille and then taking another 10 days for the honeymoon. There was nothing pressing on his calendar.
"The lion's den would be this family."
Papa's icy stare surrounded him with a chill. This family? What? Papa had nothing. It had to be so. Julian was always careful about what he subjected the family to. He may have let Madeleine down a little hard, but he'd never once put the family in harm's way.
"And the wolf is your wife."
Papa looked like a cat with feathers in its mouth. Julian's laughter echoed across the room. That was the most ridiculous thing he'd ever heard.
"That's a stretch, Papa. Please tell me you had her sign a confidentiality agreement."
It wasn't a question so much as an opinion. Confidentiality agreement? The thought hadn't crossed Julian's mind. Surely the attorneys had her sign one as part of the prenup.
"I'll take that as a no."
Papa's voice faded and he glanced down at his lap. It was only a second or two, but it felt like forever to Julian. No. He didn't say no. He didn't say anything. But, as usual, Papa had a way of reading Julian as if he were an open book. Julian rallied his desire to believe in Camille.
You have nothing to worry about.
Nothing to worry about, Papa snorted.
The girl works for a Los Angeles gossip rag called Disclosure Magazine.
He paused, his face turning red.
I think we have plenty to worry about. There has to be some mistake.
His voice weakened, right along with his confidence. Insistence and denial reeled through Julian's mind. She's an actress, not a reporter.
There's no mistake.
Papa's accusing finger pointed to the envelope that Julian still hadn't touched. But he had news for Papa. He refused to look at the information. Julian didn't believe it. Camille wasn't here under false pretenses. Whatever the truth was, he wanted to hear it from Camille herself, not some suspect report given to him by his father.
Find a way to handle this discreetly.
Papa's voice cut through the silence.
I'll handle it.
Julian rose and paused in front of his father's desk.
It's not what you think. Just see to it that she doesn't do what I think she's come here to do.
Papa's voice followed him to the door. Julian hesitated, pushing aside the thoughts invading his head. The woman he'd poured his heart out to in the garden, the woman who'd rocked his world just last night, the woman who'd promised to be his salvation. She couldn't be here after a story. Chapter 15. Camille stepped out of the marble-laid shower with its gold-plated fixtures and grabbed a hand-woven towel, the softest she'd ever seen. She draped an equally plush bathrobe around her and tied the belt before tousling her wet hair. One last quick glance into the mirror, and she pushed herself toward the gigantic suite she and Julian had moved into after returning from the honeymoon cruise last night. The suite was like its own little apartment inside this huge old house. Camille saw no reason to leave the sanctity of its walls. Anything not to run into Madeleine or Maurice. The glittering diamond necklace Julian had given her caught her eye. Before getting into the shower, she had placed it on the table by the window overlooking the rose garden. She touched the pendant, aroused by its romantic inference. Flashes of their naked bodies tangled together flittered through her mind. The thoughts made her smile. Camille had no disillusions where Julian was concerned. She knew this was temporary. Well, it had started out that way. But she had 6 months to change his mind, and hers. Julian was starting to grow on her, and she dared to entertain the notion that he could be her Prince Charming. Camille dropped into the nearby chair and glanced out the window. The roses looked like someone had come along and splattered a green canvas with every color imaginable. The suite's decor with its yellows, golds, and reds had a pleasing and calming effect. She could get used to living in Julian's world, and in his arms. A glass of champagne waited on the table beside her necklace. Someone, probably Monique, had placed it there while Camille was in the shower. Man, these people are really into drinking. Bubbles floated up the amber liquid in relegated lines. Just a sip. Besides, she needed the extra edge to get her through the ups and downs of what was to come. She'd have to be careful not to become too dependent upon the crutch. Granny May had said, more than once, that Camille's father was an alcoholic, and it was a blessing in disguise when he had run out on Camille and her mother. Camille didn't want to end up like that, deserted and pregnant. But if it did happen, she'd like to think she'd have enough wherewithal to stick by the child she'd created and not dump him or her off on the nearest relative. Not that Camille had that luxury. The door opened and Julian entered. She glanced at him and sat up. He didn't look happy. Uh-oh, what was this about? She hoped it had nothing to do with Madeleine. He began pacing the length of the room. His head jerked away from her and then back to her every couple of steps. Nerves pushed Camille out of the chair.
Julian?
She moved toward him.
What's wrong?
His hands shot into the air as if warning her not to touch him. He gave her a frown fraught with desperation.
Is it true?
Is what true?
Thoughts swarmed her brain and mingled chaotically to uncover his meaning. What had he discovered? Did he see right through her? Did he know of her secret desires now that they had consummated their marriage? Did he not want to go there? Julian elbowed his blazer back and perched his hands on his hips.
Are you or are you not an actress?
Every word came out of his mouth, articulate and accusing. That was not what she was expecting, and in fact, was the worst thing he could have asked. But did it really matter? Did he really care that much about her employment status? She wanted to say what he wanted to hear, but she wasn't sure what that was. She hesitated and sighed.
That's what I thought.
He paused and glared at her. He looked at her with such hatred it killed any confidence she'd built up during the course of the morning. Her pride and a fear of rejection wouldn't let her crumble. This was going to turn out just like every other time in her life when she'd been deserted. Julian had found a reason to erect an impenetrable wall between them. Okay, so she hadn't been completely honest, but her intentions hadn't been malicious. It wouldn't matter what she said. Julian had found his out, and she had to protect her heart from getting stomped on once again.
Just what exactly is your occupation?
His hatred lashed out at her. Camille shoved the desire to sob back down her throat.
I am currently unemployed.
That wasn't a lie. She had no job prospects, but she wasn't about to tell him why. No way was she going to make herself look like an even bigger fool. Julian's accusing laughter raked her.
Does this mean it's for sale to the highest bidder?
Huh? She fought the cobwebs of angst-filled confusion. What's for sale? She wasn't about to let Julian get the better of her, or make her look like an idiot.
Sure.
She folded her arms and tapped red-tipped fingernails against her skin. But there's a reserve on it. She paused, trying to read him, trying to figure out what he thought she had for sale. I'm not giving it away for free. For a second, he almost looked pleased, but that was quickly overshadowed by his hatred.
How much?
Her pride concealed her inner turmoil. How much for what? Frustration poured out in her broken voice. What the hell are you talking about?
You are a writer.
His nose flared and his eyes bulged.
Are you not?
He knew? Reality shuddered through her. Defeat escaped in her sharp sigh. His lips tightened as if he was biting back the words of disapproval. He shook his fist and then pointed an accusing finger at her. His cold, hard stare froze her in place like a statue and left her quivering with fear. She wasn't afraid of him physically, just emotionally. Nobody else was going to desert her. She'd break this bond before he had the chance. It really doesn't matter what I say, she said. You won't believe me. She wanted him to dispute that. She wanted him to say he wanted to hear her explanation, but he didn't.
What do you say we dispense with the pleasantries?
It sounded like a question, but she knew it was an order for something she couldn't define. She wished she knew what he was talking about.
How much?
Huh?
How much will it take for the exclusive?
Exclusive?
She was starting to sound like a parrot.
"You're insulting my intelligence."
He glowered and turned away. "Look," she said, through the mounting pressure of tears. "Just tell me what you're talking about."
"Do you deny that you answered my ad as a staff member of Disclosure magazine?"
Oh, that exclusive.
No, she didn't deny it. "Why do you ask?" She bit back the hurt. "You've obviously got it all figured out."
"How much for the exclusive?"
He repeated his question. Camille stiffened, momentarily abashed. He'd never believe her story. She felt ice spreading through her heart. "What's it worth to you?" she asked, suddenly wanting him to share in her pain. And damned if she was leaving. The way she saw it, he owed her $5 million. She was staying until he paid up.
"How about $1 million?
He offered. She hesitated, torn by his audacious belief that everybody had a price. He'd obviously read her silence as a bargaining tactic because he went into full negotiating mode.
"I doubt that rag you are working for would pay that much. You Americans really don't care that much about what the crazy French are doing."
He rolled his eyes and showered her with stinging laughter. The accusation broke Camille's heart, but she held the hurt inside. How could he think so little of her? There were a ton of things she could say to defend herself, but none of them moved her stoned lips. Finally, a single word escaped. "Deal." Julian's cold glare bored through her for what seemed an eternity before he stuck his hand out. She accepted it reluctantly. His firm grasp was cold and unfeeling, and elicited no fire, no compassion, no desire.
"There will be more papers to sign."
"I figured."
"I'll pay for the exclusive once I have your signature."
"That'll be fine." Her voice cracked, but she held the pain inside. She swallowed the overwhelming urge to cry, holding her lips together tightly to keep the tears from escaping. The glittering necklace, Julian's gift, sparkled, reminding her that his genuineness was not nearly as solid as the jewel's clarity. She reached for it, clasped it in her fist for a moment before unfolding her fingers and offering it to him. "Here. I'm sure you'll want this back," she said over her aching inner pain. Julian's cold stare squeezed her heart. He pivoted on one heel and walked away. The slamming door echoed through her. Camille folded her fingers around the pendant and sighed heavily. She'd done it this time, gotten herself into a real mess. One she was afraid she wouldn't be able to squirm her way out of. Damn. Julian slowed his pace once in the corridor leading to the main wing. An odd twinge of disappointment filled the empty cavity that used to contain his heart. He had been deserted. Again. He should have known better. The minute he put his faith and trust in a woman, she turned out to be a liar and a cheat. Camille had deceived him, just like his mother had when she told him she'd always take care of him. How was checking out fulfilling that promise? Stunned and furious, he fisted his hands at his sides. He struggled to hold his temper. God, I'm so stupid. Julian took the stairs, 2 at a time, and headed for the side service door, preferring not to run into any of the family. He had to think.
"Julien!"
Papa's voice assaulted him from behind. Damn it. He thought about not stopping, but that was a bad idea. He slid his hands into his pockets, stalled a moment, and then turned to face the criticism. All sorts of things ran through Julian's head, none of them good. Not the kind of things you say to your father. He wished Papa hadn't been so hell-bent on destroying his marriage, as foe as it was to Camille. This was one time Julian would have much rather been left in the dark. At least until they were closer to the end of the 6 months. If Papa wanted to destroy it then, more power to him. But why'd he have to do it now? Especially now that Julian and Camille had come to an understanding.
"Did you take care of our problem?" Papa asked. "We don't have a problem. That's not the way I see it." "How do you see it, Papa?" Julian dared to raise his voice to his father. "She's my wife and has no bearing on anyone else in this family." "I might buy that if she weren't a reporter after a story about this family." His voice matched Julian's. "What's the matter, Papa?" Julian's animosity escaped in his words. "Are you afraid some of your skeletons are going to come out of the closet?" "You'd better worry about your own skeletons, boy." Papa looked ready to explode. "There is such a thing as bad publicity, and we don't want ours to start in some American trash magazine." "I've taken care of that," Julian said, his tone calming. "From here on out, you will say nothing, and I do mean nothing, about this to anyone." "You presume to tell me what to do?" "Papa, you wanted me to fix it. I did." Julian sucked in a deep breath. "Now, I'm asking you to drop it." Papa studied him for a long moment. His way of bullying. It wasn't working. Julian was way beyond intimidation. Allowing the coercion would ruin his plan. He walked away. "Where are you going?" Papa called after him. "Madeleine!" Julian flung around and pitched his finger in the air at his father. "She'd better be gone!" "Julian!" Papa chastised him with laughter. "You can't really expect me to turn out an old family friend." "Fine." Julian paused, preparing to call his bluff. "Camille and I will leave." "All right." Papa waved his hands in the air. "All right. I'll see what I can do." Julian continued on, walking away. "When you figure it out," he glanced over his shoulder, "you can reach me at the Beauvau." Chapter 16. Camille sat on one side of the limousine, next to one door, and Julian against the other. He'd made it clear he wanted nothing more to do with her. She was there for a purpose, to help him avoid a real marriage to Madeleine, and at the end of 6 months, he'd gladly release her. Well, if he could walk away without so much as a second thought, she could reciprocate, even if she had to force herself. She turned toward him, but avoided looking into his eyes.
"Is it too much to ask where we're going?"
Her tone carried no pleasantries. Camille rotated her gaze back toward the window and glued it on the quick-passing scenery. "The Beauvau," he said in a flat, monotone voice.
"The Beauvau."
She repeated his words, and let her gaze take the slow journey to look at him.
"Why are we going there?"
she asked, overcome by guilt.
"It's not because of me, is it?"
"You give yourself too much credit, chérie," he sneered. "This is a war between my father and me. It has nothing to do with you."
He looked disgusted by the sight of her, and directed his attention back out the window. Julian rested his hand on his thigh. Long bronzed fingers that had caressed her so lovingly yesterday tapped out today's irritation. There would be no gentle touches, no sweet caresses, no words of love. If that's the way he wanted to play it, she'd be more than accommodating. Camille crowded herself against the door. This was probably just his staged way out. Julien de Laurent had turned every aspect of his life into a life-and-death drama. He'd gone to great lengths to avoid a real marriage. Whatever happened to, "Sorry, Pops, but I just don't want to marry her"? Instead, he'd gone to America and hired her, a stranger, to pretend to be his wife for 6 months until his father got over his fascination. What kind of people did that? Rich ones, that's who. People with way too much money at their disposal. People who are used to getting what they want. People who give no forethought to those they step on in the process. The next 6 months was going to be hell. "What pisses you off more?" she asked, without looking at him. "My seemingly ulterior motive, or that your father had to do your homework for you?" She suspected she had jabbed him good with that one and mustered the courage to look at him. For a split second, she almost saw the hint of humorous appreciation trying to light his eyes. Soon it was overshadowed by his swelling anger. Or maybe it was hurt. He chose not to speak, just stared at her with a dark, infuriated glare. It unnerved her, and she had a pretty good idea that was his plan. Camille would love to not give him the satisfaction of letting him get to her, if she could just figure out how. But he had. When had that happened? Julien blasted her with a quick dousing of French, which she didn't understand. But if she had to guess, she'd say it wasn't good. She stared him down with what she hoped said, "Your lecture is falling on deaf ears with me." "Of course you don't understand French." He gave her one of those dismissive looks he had kept in reserve for his servants until now. "No, I skipped that class in high school." "As if your high school French would have been adequate." Julien's obnoxious laughter bruised her ego. Spiteful jerk. "Look, I just want to know why we're going to a hotel."
"And I told you."
Lord, he was making this hard. Harder than it had to be. "Okay, if we don't want to stay at the house, for whatever reason—" She paused, trying to reason the frivolous expenditure in her head. "Why are we going to a hotel? Why aren't we going back to the Naoma Louise?" Julien shrugged. Obviously, he hadn't considered that option. "I know it's none of my business. It's your money and all." Anxiety escaped in her nervous laughter. "But I just don't understand why you're spending money on a hotel when you've got a perfectly good yacht," she said, even though she felt like she'd overstepped her boundaries. Julien, on the other hand, looked like a light bulb had gone off inside his head. He turned to her and seemed to be fighting a smile.
"That's a really good idea."
The anger and annoyance had deserted his voice, leaving behind nothing but indifference. He nodded, as if making the final decision, and hit the intercom.
"Sébastien, let's go to the marina instead,"
he said, and released the button. The remainder of the drive passed in silence and the ever-growing presence of tension. Was $5 million worth all this? Was it worth 6 months of ridicule and hostilities from a man she could have easily fallen for? Was she seriously thinking she could survive that? Not even close. No way. Sebastian opened the limousine's door, and a blast of warm, salty sea air hit Julien. He would have enjoyed it, if not for the circumstances. His main objective was to get on board the Naoma Louise and go below deck, where he planned on hibernating until he had recovered from this malady. Or maybe he'd drop Camille off at the Naoma Louise and then head on over to the Beauvau. If it weren't for the reason he'd married her, to avoid a marriage with Madeleine, Julien would just give her the money he had promised her and send her on her way. But that would put him right back where he started, in the one place he didn't want to be. Available. Julien stepped on board and, without thinking, stopped and extended his hand to Camille. For the first time in his life, Julien had been civil without an ulterior motive. the consummate gentleman. His mother would be so proud. He knew he was probably smiling at Camille, and he remedied that right away by plastering on his hardest practiced stare. She looked vulnerable. He wanted to believe the best of her, but she made it hard. Falling back into her snare wasn't wise. Julian dropped her hand, letting it fall away. He opened the door and again, subconsciously waited for her to enter first. Cool air wafted past as he followed her inside.
The papers will be delivered later today, sealing our deal.
He moved to the bar, ready to pour himself a drink, but changed his mind. Whatever. She dropped to the couch, crossed her legs, and played with her fingernails, which she had changed to a bright red. Very different from the pastel shades of pink and orange he was used to seeing. Julian searched the bar for water, opening several decanters and sniffing the liquids inside. All were liquor of some sort. Frustration balled inside him and knotted in his gut. What did a man have to do to get some water? He grabbed the phone on the bar and punched in a number.
Soren, can we get some water in here?
He didn't immediately hang up. Instead, he added,
Thank you.
That probably surprised Soren as much as it did Julian. Maybe he was getting sick. Figures. He'd caught a case of the pleasantries. He leaned against a bar stool, caressed his forehead, and massaged his temples. Julian. She paused, hesitating. He caught a stealthy gaze toward her. She looked like she'd been defeated.
Yeah.
If leaving the house had anything at all to do with me.
She stopped and drew a breath before continuing.
I know you say it wasn't me, but just in case I was any kind of factor.
She dared to look at him.
I'm sorry if I played even a small part in that.
Amazing. She looked genuinely sorry. How could she regret that and in the same breath turn around and make a mental note to add it in her story? It was probably just a ploy to make herself look better in the final copy. She was doing a good job of assuming the role of victim. If she wasn't an actress, she'd missed her calling.
I told you, he said. It has nothing to do with you.
Then why?
She asked.
Why did we leave?
Maybe he should tell her. Keep her off his back. Otherwise, she'd go on incorrectly telling herself that she had somehow played a part in this disaster.
It's not about you.
He smiled, feeling like he'd won some small battle.
It's about Madeleine.
Madeleine?
Papa wants her to stay. I want her gone.
Camille nodded. I can understand that, considering the lengths you went to avoid marrying her. She snickered. Perhaps that hadn't been the smartest idea. His selfishness had allowed a member of the press to infiltrate the family undetected. It's a good thing Papa still had his wits about him. Julian stood and headed for the door, stopping only to glimpse over his shoulder at Camille.
Soren will come for you when the papers arrive.
He slipped into the hallway, needing to put some space between himself and Camille. Camille was awakened by the knock at the door. She lifted her head off the pillow and looked around groggily. Oh, yeah. She'd grown tired of sitting in the upper-deck lounge all alone, but remembered closing her eyes for just a second. Nothing made the time pass like sleeping your life away. She sighed and fell back on the couch. The knock came again, more persistent this time.
Madame de Laurent?
Soren's voice floated through the walls.
Yes.
She sighed and closed her eyes. Maybe he'd go away. Doubtful. He worked for Julian.
Monsieur de Laurent asked me to come for you, he called through the door. Your signature is required.
Camille pushed herself into a sitting position.
I'll be there directly.
Damn, she was starting to sound like Julian. Camille drew in a deep breath and sighed. Okay, time to face the music. She just wished the musician played a more agreeable tune. Having no other choice was the factor that pushed her off the couch. The plush carpet offered little comfort as she studied her messy hair in the mirror. Not caring about impressions, she ran her fingers through it a few times, straightened her blouse, and headed out into the hallway where Soren was waiting. Okay, so now she needed a chaperone? What, did Julian think she was going to steal the silver? Camille followed Soren to the top-deck salon. Julian and his attorney, what was his name, were huddled over the bar, enthralled in deep conversation. Julian looked up. She could tell when he had seen her. His demeanor soured.
Here she is.
Julian offered no smile. His eyes didn't light up. In fact, he just looked annoyed. Okay, she said, dropping onto the couch. So he was going to be a jerk. Two could play that game. Let's get this over with. She winced as the words poured from her mouth. Julian shuffled across the room and sat beside her. Draping his arm around her, he whispered, "Now, darling." He called her darling instead of chérie. She didn't like that.
There's no need to be a bitch.
No, that's your girlfriend's job.
She flashed him a look that must have been effective because his confidence wilted, if only for a second or two.
Good one.
He winked at her and pushed himself off the couch. He stood over her, extending his hand. She took it, trying to erect a stronger guard against his charms. Julian tugged her across the room, settling her at the bar where his attorney had a mass of paperwork laid out. She waited for an introduction. None came. The lawyer handed her a fountain pen. She took it and looked at Julian.
You signed it already?
He nodded. If you'll just sign here. The attorney pointed to a blank line beneath Julian's signature. Camille snatched the papers off the counter and began reviewing them. Julian snickered. She ignored him. He was not as cute as he thought. If she kept telling herself that, sooner or later she might buy into the notion. The document read pretty standard. She was selling her story exclusively to De Laurent Enterprises. Pretty amusing, since she hadn't planned on writing one in the first place. Camille signed all copies of the agreement and laid the gold-plated pen on the counter along with the papers. "Is that all?" she said to Julian.
"For now."
He winked at her and turned away. Jerk. Camille pushed off from the bar and headed for the door. There wasn't a reason in the world that she should put up with his asinine ways. She let the door slam behind her as she left. Julian jumped and laughed comically. She was mad. Good. So was he.
How long before the money is wired into the account?
Tomorrow, Davis said, gathering the documents. I'll get these filed and bring your copies around tomorrow.
Can you bring some documentation from the bank confirming the transfer?
Of course, he said, stuffing the paperwork inside his attaché. Is there anything else I can do for you today? He added, closing the case.
No, I think that'll do it.
Julian moved behind the bar and headed for the liquor. It was time for a drink. He grabbed a glass and filled it with a generous serving of the closest bottle. Julian studied it for a moment before pouring it into his mouth. He swished it and swirled it around, letting the sting diminish before swallowing the tart liquid. He slammed the glass down on the bar. It wasn't often that he got married and taken for a ride all at the same time. There was almost something enticing about her outwitting him. Almost. Chapter 17. Within 2 days, Papa had moved Madeleine to town. For the first time, Julian felt he'd won in a battle of wills with his father. It wasn't often that Papa gave up, in effect admitting defeat. Too bad Julian's victory was overshadowed by Camille's deception, but still he had to honor his end of the bargain no matter what her motives were for accepting the deal. He didn't have to like it, but he had to accept the inevitable. Camille had handled the constant shuffling between the house and the yacht like a champion. When he said it was time to go back to Pacifique de Lumière, she'd agreed without a second thought. She looked bored over the whole mess, more than anything else. He'd been holding on to the filed papers and the bank transfer receipt for the last couple of days just because he could. Since they'd signed the documents, he wanted to see how long it'd take her to ask for the money. She hadn't, and he found that irksome. She spent her time inside their suite or in the garden, usually alone. He felt sorry for her and envied her at the same time over her aloneness and her ability to find solitude in it. Having no one to beleaguer or infuriate you must be great, yet lonely. If there's no one to bother you, there's also no one to love you. But since when had that mattered to him? He opened the door to the main parlor in their suite. She was sitting facing the window. Her still frame didn't move. She didn't acknowledge his presence. He tapped the manila envelope against his palm and cleared his throat. She glanced over her shoulder, stared right through him, and turned back to the window. After a moment of immobility, she pushed herself up and turned to face him. Her stoic expression gave nothing away about what she was feeling. Camille clasped her hands together and raised her gaze to meet his. She didn't say anything, just looked at him with cold, hard eyes. Julian vowed to show her just how little she affected him. He drew a breath and acknowledged the envelope in his hand.
"I thought you might like these."
He kept his voice calm and on a low, even keel. She shrugged and folded her arms in front of her. As if the distance across the room wasn't enough, she'd erected another barrier. Part of him wanted to reach out to her, but it was smothered by the part that loathed her actions, loathed that she'd come to him under false pretenses, loathed that she had made him look like a fool. Nobody got away with that.
"This is your copy of our agreement."
He waved the envelope in the air.
"The bank receipt is in here too. Your acceptance of this money seals our deal."
He paused, ruthlessness invading his tone.
"Make no mistake, if you discuss this family with any outlets of the media, I will sue you."
She came toward him, her eyes darkening dangerously. Ignoring the envelope, she reacted with nothing more than a couple of pronounced blinks. Other than that, she was like a statuette poised in permanent indifference.
"Have you nothing to say?"
His anger escaped in a harsh growl. "What do you want me to say, Julian?" He moved a couple of steps toward her, and she backed up. Julian's heart ached with defeat. He wanted her to say it was all a lie, but she couldn't do that. So what was the point?
"Can you say it's not true?"
he asked.
"Can you tell me you're not a writer and you weren't employed at some tabloid when you met me?"
The look on her face, guilt, said it all.
"I thought so."
"You've already passed judgment on me." The vibrancy left her face. "Anything I say from here on out is just wasting my breath." True, she had a point. He was beyond listening to or wanting to hear excuses. Julian had to give her credit for having her own sense of self-respect, even if it was distorted. It was going to be an awkward 6 months. There wasn't much left to do or say. He looked at the envelope in his hand, then to the sofa, before moving on to the coffee table to the left. One more glimpse of her cold, stoic face convinced him to toss the envelope at the table. It sailed through the air and slid across the tabletop, stopping in the center. Julian gave her one last consideration. She hadn't moved or changed her expression. He was wasting his time. Irritation shoved his regret aside and pivoted him around, forcing him toward the door. He left, letting it swing shut with a bit of a slam. He winced and headed on down the hallway. The next 6 months were not going to be pleasant ones. He'd find a way to conquer his affliction because, as bad as this was, being married to Madeleine would still be worse. Camille grabbed a pillow from the nearby chair and threw it at the door. She'd been wrong when she called him a jerk. He wasn't just a jerk. Julian de Laurent was a complete jerk. Imagine someone wanting you to defend yourself when they had no intention of listening to a word you said. Camille wasn't groveling at anybody's feet, least of all his. It would come to nothing because it was only for his own amusement. The envelope he had left on the table seemed to be his bargaining chip. Well, sure, it contained the means to $1 million. Or so he said. Curiosity pushed her toward the table. She picked up the envelope with casual grace and hesitated a moment before easing the flap open. The agreement didn't interest her as much as the bank transfer. Seeing all those zeros next to her name made her heart skip a beat. In a matter of seconds, all her financial problems had disappeared. $1 million might be chump change to a guy like Julian, but for a girl like Camille, it could change her life. But was the payment of $5 million worth 6 months of what she had just endured? Could she stand 6 months of ridicule and rejection and dismissal from Julian? She'd have to if she wanted the money. Wait. She had decided to stick around because she needed the money. Not anymore. She was now in possession of $1 million. Payment in full for a story she had never intended to write. Why should she stick around and subject herself to Julian's BS when it was no longer necessary? There was no longer a reason. Not anymore. And she liked the idea of being paid for a story much better than being paid for a marriage, even if it was less money. But hell, $1 million was plenty for Camille. It would set her up nicely. Okay, so all she needed to do was find someone to help her start the divorce proceedings. Julian wasn't the best bet. He'd try to talk her out of it since he had a little problem he liked to call Madeleine. But Julian had, like Granny May used to say, made his bed and now he'd have to lay in it. He'd hurt her feelings and stung her ego, and there was no going back from that. Why should she continue to help him? Not even $5 million was worth sacrificing her dignity. With that in mind, Camille knew she had to confide in at least one member of the de Laurent family. And there was only one who could come close to relating. Only one that might listen before judging. Only one that might agree to help Camille. Camille was thrilled when Claudette kept their lunch date that afternoon. It meant Maurice hadn't gotten to her, hadn't told Claudette what he knew. She hoped she was right, and her stepmother-in-law still remembered and understood what it was like to try to fit into this family of well-bred jackasses. They opted for a little sidewalk cafe where the staff knew Claudette and were overly attentive to her every desire. Camille had rehearsed what she'd say to Claudette 100 times in her mind, but that hadn't helped to calm her nerves. What if she was wrong about Claudette? What if she was just as judgmental as the rest of them? What if pigs could fly? She pushed the silly anxieties aside. Nobody could be as judgmental as those de Laurent men, Maurice and Julian in particular. Strategically, Claudette's induction into the family was the place to start. Take her back to what it felt like when she first arrived.
Claudette. Camille let her name amble off her tongue. What was it like for you when you married Maurice? She asked, playing with the food on her plate. Did fitting in come easy for you?
Easy? Claudette laughed and rattled off a few words in French before returning to English. I not only became the mother of 2 small children, but I had to follow in the footsteps of a woman who'd been put up on a pedestal and then devastated an entire family when she fell off.
Camille hadn't looked at it like that.
She'd only seen Naoma's life and death from Julian's point of view. A broken-hearted son.
I can't imagine what that must have been like for you.
Sadness stabbed at Camille's chest.
I know it devastated Julian.
Julien.
Claudette's face softened. Clearly, she loved him like any mother would love her son.
He was such a dear, sweet boy, and so young and broken-hearted over losing his mother.
Her expression was one of quiet dejection.
It took a very long time to get him to accept my love. He was afraid I was going to leave too.
What about you and Maurice? Did he have trust issues?
Camille regretted it as soon as she asked. Claudette snorted.
Still does.
She rolled her eyes and a muscle quivered at her jaw.
Sometimes I think Maurice doesn't even trust himself.
He doesn't trust me.
It's not that he doesn't trust you.
Her words weren't bitter, just logical.
You made it impossible for him to get the daughter-in-law he wants.
Camille hadn't looked at it like that. Still, it wasn't her problem.
He has another son.
Ah, yes. And a specific wife picked out for him, too.
A flicker of amusement flittered across her eyes.
And he's not likely to get that one any more than he did the last.
Well, he shouldn't give up hope on Madeleine just yet, Camille said, with some remorse. He's still got a chance, if he can convince Julian.
Claudette studied her with a scrutinizing eye.
Julien doesn't love Madeleine.
He doesn't love me either.
Claudette's expression skewed into a thinking face that evoked her thoughts to the surface.
I think he does.
I'm going to tell you something that is going to violate a contract.
Camille paused. It was better to just say it and get it over with. That way the contract would be broken and she could go home.
Our marriage is a business deal, a marriage of convenience.
Claudette's mouth fell open. Clearly a notion she hadn't suspected.
Julian came to America looking for a temporary wife so he could avoid being pressured into marriage with Madeleine.
She searched for the next set of words that would make sense of her reasoning and not make her look like a villain.
He placed an ad in the LA Trades for an actress.
There was something liberating about admitting the truth.
I, at the instruction of my boss, answered the ad. I was just supposed to see what Julian was up to. That's it. But my boss at Disclosure magazine wanted a story with all the dirt on Julien de Laurent.
She shook her head. Even she was starting to see herself as the bad guy. Claudette didn't say anything. She just listened.
There was something about Julian from the get-go. He makes you want to help him.
He has that effect on most people.
I told my boss I wouldn't write the story. She threatened to fire me, so I quit.
Camille had no regrets about standing up to her ex-boss at Disclosure magazine, but right now her ethics weren't making her feel any better.
For a young girl, alone in the world, and having no job or viable job prospects, the world is a scary place.
Claudette's expression softened. She did understand.
Camille sighed, relieved.
I'm sure you were very afraid, and the tiniest part of you
probably wanted to help Julien. That's true. But it was more about me, she admitted with a regrettable shrug. I was afraid for myself. I was afraid of ending up homeless. So you went to Julien and accepted his offer? Yes. And you didn't tell him about your boss or that you'd quit your job because of him? No, I didn't. And somewhere along the way, you fell in love with Julien. Well, I wouldn't say that. If she said it, that'd make it real. And it couldn't be real because she'd end up heartbroken. So, what happened? She asked, studying Camille. Did Julien find out about your job? Camille nodded. Maurice made it a point to dig up the dirt on me. She laughed at the irony. Of course. She threw her hands into the air. This has my husband written all over it, jackass that he is. Julien is so angry with me, Camille said. He thinks I'm here to get that story, and he's not going to believe otherwise, unless you come up with a way to prove it to him. Camille hadn't thought of that. That is the way of the De Laurent men, her spirited voice pealed on. Lovable as they are, they're idiots when it comes to matters of the heart. I'm going to divorce Julien. It is the only thing to do, she said, especially if you want him back. Camille came out of her despondence and looked at Claudette. What makes you think he'd have me back? Because he loves you. Camille had given up on that when Julien lost the spark in his eyes. Well, I don't think that's going to happen. I just want this to be over. The words shuddered through her. I can't stand the way he looks at me now. He's going to have to lose you before he can appreciate you. Claudette leaned toward Camille. But don't be foolish. Don't give him any ammunition to validate what he thinks is the truth. Take every piece of his so-called proof and ram it back at him before you leave. Camille tried to think of how she could make that happen. Don't tell him you're leaving either. He'll talk you out of it, she said, and you'll both lose if that happens. You're probably right. Camille wasn't willing to spend the next 6 months learning to hate Julien. She'd rather lose now than have hatred attached later on down the line. I happen to know that André is planning a trip to the U.S. Her tone was born in suggestive innocence. To see your friend? Camille laughed inside. That would snap Maurice's sanity. Do you know someone who can draw up divorce papers quickly? Camille asked, walking a tightrope of hope. A thought, an idea came to her. It was risky. She'd lost all hope for any kind of a solid relationship with Julien. But if she had any hope of proving herself to him, she had to take that chance. Chapter 18. Julien's limousine rolled to a stop in front of the house. The weather hadn't bothered to cooperate for his return from a business trip to London. Rain continued in a torrential downpour, and he jumped out of the car without a second thought and faced the brunt of the storm head-on. While away, he'd had plenty of time to think things through. Perhaps he'd been a bit hard on Camille. Sure, she had come to him under false pretenses, but when had that ever stopped him? Where was his sense of adventure? Who said he couldn't change her mind, charm her out of her intentions? She'd come there for a story, but who's to say it couldn't turn into something more, something meaningful, something real? He slinked out of his overcoat and shook the water off his hands and arms. Papa would want to see him, but Julien was more interested in talking to Camille and figuring out if there was a chance for them to salvage their amiable relationship, or if he was just fooling himself. There were only 2 places she would be, the gardens or their suite, and the rain canceled out the first option. Julien headed up the stairs, taking them 2 at a time. "Chérie," he called out, entering their suite. Nothing. He moved from one room to the next,
expecting to find her in each. Again, nothing.
Camille?
Anxiety knotted in his gut as he opened the door to the bedchamber, the only room left to examine inside the suite. The bed was made, the room was empty, and the bathroom door was open. Julian stopped, perched his hands on his hips, and surveyed his surroundings. Where in the hell was Camille? Maybe she was in town with Claudette and Lacey. They'd probably gone shopping and were likely to return in time for dinner, along with a big, hefty bill. Julian laughed. He was beyond caring. He just wanted to see Camille. He went back out into the outer rooms of the suite and prepared to meet with Papa. He would have made it out the door, too, if it hadn't been for the document lying on the table along with Camille's wedding rings and her necklace. Curiosity pushed him to check it out. His heart rate increased as he reached for the folded document. A bill of divorcement. Her signature had been penned in black ink. All he had to do was sign it, and he'd be a free man. Free to get pushed in the direction of Madeleine. The hell with that. She couldn't do this to him. She couldn't throw him to the wolves. She couldn't pretend they'd never happened. Where was she? He tossed the document back onto the table, and the bank receipt fell out. Julian snatched it up and looked at the paper. $1 million had been transferred back into its originating account. Joy over the notion that she had chosen him was overshadowed by the fear that she'd gotten a better offer for her story. Oh, shit. Julian's first instincts led him to the closet and her dressers. All her things, the things he'd bought her, were still there. Good. He stormed out into the hallway. She was here in the house somewhere, and Julian set out to find her. He ran into Andre coming up the stairs.
Andre, have you seen my wife?
He asked, stopping just past his brother on the staircase. Andre grabbed the banister and crooked halfway around and flashed Julian with a confused look.
Your wife? Yes, Camille. Have you seen her? You didn't know?
Fear darkened Andre's demeanor.
Know what?
Julian asked, having little patience.
I thought you knew.
Andre paused, slinking up the stairs, outside Julian's reach. Claudette appeared at the top and moved down between them. Julian didn't pay much attention to her, and he didn't think Andre had either.
I went to see Tasha while you were gone, and Camille hitched a ride with me. Her words, not mine.
He chuckled, seemingly amused by the axiom.
What?
Julian's voice shrieked as he lurched toward his brother. Andre backed up the steps.
She said you'd understand, not to mention agree. No, I don't understand.
Julian huffed out his disapproval.
And no, I don't agree. Well, don't yell at me. Why not? Julian asked. You took her away. What's the big deal? Andre shrugged. Just go get her.
Julian considered it for a second. He shook his head. That's no good. What if she's gone to L.A. to sell her story? What if she didn't care about his feelings at all? What if she turned out to be just like his mother?
If you're not sure you can trust her,
Claudette said, as if she'd read Julian's mind,
you can always play the wait-and-see card. That way you'll know.
That was a great idea. Claudette headed down the stairs, and a few steps from the bottom she glanced over her shoulder.
But don't wait too long.
Julian stormed outside, where he hoped the rain had stopped. He'd talk to Papa later. Right now he needed to think. If he made it outside without running into Papa, he'd be happy. Just a couple of steps and he was home free. He laid his hand on the doorknob, expecting to hear Papa's voice spoiling his escape. The door opened in silence, and Julian slipped outside. Luckily, the rain had stopped. Julian ran through the gardens until he got to the hidden clearing that not too many people beyond the gardeners had discovered. He sat on the bench, the same bench he'd sat on with Camille just weeks earlier, and ignored the pool of rainwater. The Roman goddess statue, the protector of the garden, offered no comfort today. In fact, the rain made her look like she had tears falling from her porcelain eyes. Julian hated that. It made him feel like his mother was crying since she was the one who'd put the sculpture in the garden. Julian had to forget about his own feelings and consider the family's welfare. He had to figure out if Camille had come there looking for a story. Only time would tell. Camille had never hated the sound of an alarm clock beeping incessantly as much as she did this morning. She awakened from her deep, dreamless sleep. Reality set in. She was in Tasha's living room. The last few days, hanging out and sleeping on her best friend's couch was a far cry from the luxury she'd experienced with Julian, but she didn't belong in Julian's world. Now she was back in her own, and it was a shock, to say the least. But not nearly as much of a shock as waitressing at the 4th Street Diner. A couple of months ago, Camille would have never pictured herself working there. But Julian de Laurent had taught her a thing or two. First, she was capable of taking care of herself. And that brought her to the second. Maybe writing wasn't quite so important to her after all. Not if she had to compromise her principles for the sake of some tabloid's bottom line. She sighed, threw the blanket back, and swung her feet onto the floor. The clock said 10:30 a.m. She was due at work in less than 4 hours. Oh, God. She dropped her face into her hands, fearful of never finding a way out of the fog between her heart and her mind. How was she ever going to get off Tasha's couch, averaging a lousy $250 a week? Tasha dropped into the chair kitty-cornered from the couch. "So, I'm thinking," she said in that provisional tone that told Camille she was up to something. "Let's use some of the money you gave me to get a 2-bedroom apartment." Camille wanted to send the money back to Julian, what was left of it anyway. Using it was a bad idea. "Just hear me out." Tasha's hand flew up. "We need a bigger place so you'll have your own bedroom. We can send Julian what's left with an IOU for the remainder." She was optimistic about her plan, more so than Camille. "We can make monthly payments to him on the rest, which is actually more my bill than yours. But I gave you that money," Camille reminded Tasha. "I'm the one in debt." "I'm not going to argue with you about this." Tasha's voice heightened, and she leaned toward Camille. "Either we're both in debt, or neither of us is in debt." Camille didn't like it. She didn't like being indebted to Julian for anything. She wanted a free and clear break from him. If nothing else, she wanted him to understand that she had never set out to use or hurt him. She had just wanted to help Julian. And if she was being honest, she wanted to help herself. And in turn, her whole world had been turned upside down. But she didn't have time to worry about that. She had to get something to eat and get ready to go to work. Plus, if she didn't agree to Tasha's plan, she'd never hear the end of it. Nor could she keep living on her friend's couch. She'd have to go along with Tasha and hope Julian understood. Okay. Camille pushed herself up and stumbled toward the one and only bathroom in the small 1-bedroom apartment. "Can you get us a bigger place here? That'd be convenient." "There's a 2-bedroom available downstairs." "Ooh, downstairs." The possibilities swarmed Camille's mind as she entered the bathroom. She checked her reflection in the mirror, ignoring her disheveled hair and the dark shadows surrounding her reddened eyes. She'd made a mess of things. Who knew she'd end up actually wanting Julian's approval? Camille squared her shoulders and lifted her chin. She'd have to make the best of the bad situation and accept that her life was going to be lonely without Julian.